Do mine. I don't know. Good morning, everybody. We're going to get started. I do want to say these first two rows are reserved. If somebody needs a good view of the interpreter or the captions, they're welcome to sit in one of these first two reserved rows in order to have that view. We need to make every single thing accessible to every single person with a disability. Stevie Wonder, world famous blind singer, said this before presenting the Song of the Year award at the 58th Grammy Awards in 2015. My name is Katie Hunt Thomas. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Disability Rights Attorney for the Ability Center of Greater Toledo. I'm a middle-aged woman with light brown hair that's shoulder length and blue eyes. Over the past 2 years, I have seen more and more organizations make a commitment to accessibility. But we still know that those organizations still need guidance on both the tenets of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and also how to fulfill their commitment to accessibility. That's why the Ability Center offers educational opportunities like this seminar and our Access Network, a collection of organizational representatives from agencies committed to accessibility. We appreciate everyone's attendance today to learn more about effective communication, which is a legal obligation for state and local governments and places of public accommodation to ensure communication with people with disabilities is effective. Thank you for being here. And at this time, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Howard Rosenblum. Howard is the Chief Executive Officer of the National Association of the Deaf. He also serves as legal director and works closely with the NAD lawyers on policy advocacy and litigation work. He has been instrumental in significant legal victories, such as NAD v. Netflix, NAD v. Harvard, NAD v. MIT, NAD v. Trump, and Perez v. Sturgis Public Schools. Mr. Rosenblum has been a lawyer for over 30 years, including 12 years at the NAD, 9 years as senior attorney at Equip for Equality, a nonprofit organization in Illinois, and 10 years with a private law firm. He currently serves as a legal advisor to the World Federation of the Deaf. In 2010, and again in 2014, he was appointed by President Obama to serve on the U.S. Access Board. Mr. Rosenblum received his law degree from IIT Chicago-Kent College of Law and his Bachelor of Science degree in Computer Engineering from the University of Arizona. We are so grateful to have you here today, and I will turn the mic over to you.
Hello, everybody. It seems that a lot of people are sitting in the back of the room. I know I'm from Chicago, but I swear I'm not that scary. But I am happy to see everybody here today. So today I would like to talk mostly about effective communication, and that is an element that is often overlooked when we're talking about the ADA. There's a lot of focus on physical accessibility, which of course is important, but it's also valuable to have sensory access as well. And that is what effective communication is under. So if we can go to the next slide. So this is a little bit about the organization that I work for, which is the National Association of the Deaf. It was established back in 1880 in Cincinnati, Ohio, actually. So in your great state. The National Association of the Deaf was actually founded by deaf people. And it has had a board running the organization since 1880 that is compiled of entirely deaf individuals. We didn't have an office with a staff in it until 1966. But from that point on, we have had a functioning full-time staff and office. And I am the 7th CEO of NAD. Currently, we have about 14 members on our staff, and the board consists of 16 board members. And those board members represent all different areas of the United States. So like I said, NAD was founded in 1880 and is one of the oldest national civil rights organizations in America. There are 2 other organizations that will argue that they're older than us, but one, if you don't believe it, is the NRA, the National Rifle Association, which, you know, I don't know if we often consider them a civil rights organization, but they fight for what they claim are rights to the Second Amendment and consider themselves a civil rights organization. But they actually started initially as a sports club, and they weren't in that iteration on working on quote unquote civil rights until much, much later. So they are technically older than our organization, but I wouldn't say that they focused on civil rights for their entire entity. The other organization is the NAACP. But they were actually founded in 1910, somewhere around that time. And since we were founded in 1880, we are technically older, although of course the NAACP is more well-known and has been more powerful, and we admittedly have learned a lot from them and their methodology, but again, we are the oldest, so we take pride in that. And our mission at the NAD is to preserve, protect, and promote the civil, human, and linguistic rights of all deaf, deafblind, deaf disabled, hard of hearing, and late deafened people in the United States of America. Studies show there's about 48 million people in the United States that have some form of hearing loss due to deafness, which is a large number, and it's a high percentage of our population. So we strive to meet the communication needs of everybody under that umbrella. And those communication needs are wide and varied. There's some people who use sign language, some people who don't use sign language at all, some people use a mix of it, possibly use speech reading capabilities or cued speech, or also using Braille or protactile sign language. If you're not familiar with that, tactile and protactile sign language is the one where somebody's hands is on the other person's hands while they're signing to make it accessible for deaf-blind individuals. So again, it just touches on the variety of communication needs. And we are experts in effective communication for other disabilities as well. There are people who maybe are blind or have other visual impairments that aren't deaf. There's people who might have cognitive disabilities, people who have autism. And a lot of these differing individuals all deserve equal effective communication under the ADA. Next slide, please. So, who am I? I have worked as a lawyer for 31 years. Yes, I am that old. I started my career as an attorney, and as the same year that the ADA actually came into effect. That was the first year I started my law career in 1992. So my career has been paralleled with the ADA throughout this whole time. So I started working in Chicago. I graduated from law school there. And of course, as a deaf person, the first client that I actually provided services for was myself. So just to share a little funny story, one might not seem completely funny, but a story about my experience. When I passed the bar exam, the first thing, that lawyers usually do is you have to be sworn in to be able to practice law. So at that time, I got in touch with the Illinois Supreme Court, because they're the ones that actually, provide the ceremony and do the swearing in of everybody who passed the bar exam to become attorneys. And it's a pretty big event. So I got in touch with them and asked if they would be providing an interpreter for me. And their response was, well, you can just bring your own. This was from the Supreme Court of the state of Illinois. I knew that the ADA was a new law, but they should have already been aware of it. It was already enacted in November, which was a few months before this. And I reminded them of that, and they said they were going to think about it and get back to me. And about a week later, they responded that they would definitely be providing an interpreter for me. So, I thought to myself, well, man, I'm already a damn good lawyer. I already convinced the Supreme Court of Illinois. And the second part was when I was doing the swearing into the oath to be able to practice law in federal court. For that, it's a different ceremony that you have to go through to do federal court. And this was in the Federal District of Illinois. So I contacted them about the swearing in and told them that I needed an interpreter. And again, I was told to bring my own interpreter. So again, I said, have you heard of the ADA? And they said that they had, but that it did not apply to them, which was true because this is a federal court. And the ADA does not actually apply to the federal government. There is a different law, which is the Rehabilitation Act, we're going to be talking about in a little bit. But at that moment, I was like, okay, what do I do now? And then I remembered about the Rehabilitation Act, and I reminded them of that law. And so they said that did not apply to the judicial branch of the federal government. So then I was thinking to myself, does that mean I don't have any rights within the federal judicial system? And that was true. Even to this day, there is no law that requires the federal judicial system to provide interpreters. So I thought, wow, I'm going to have to practice, law in front of the federal court to get them to enforce the ADA. And again, at that time, I just started working at a disability rights firm in Chicago. So I went to my boss there and told them that I wanted to sue the federal government for access. And, they brought it to my attention again that there was no law. There was no equal protection of accessing your rights from the Constitution because of no law being in place. And they considered it because nobody had tried doing this before. So after I had requested to have an interpreter, a little while later, the federal court said that they thought it would be nice of them to provide me an interpreter for the swearing in ceremony, but that it was going to be a one-time thing only, and that they would not agree to provide interpreters holistically after that point. So then I got to thinking, and I was like, okay, so I'll be able to be sworn in, but then what? Now, luckily, not long after that, there was a group called the AOC. And I'm not talking about the legislator, the congresswoman, who is wonderful. She's great, but different AOC. It's the Administrative Office of the Courts is what AOC stands for. And so they actually are in charge of running different things for the courts. Now, they passed a rule, not a law, but they passed a rule for the Administrative Office of the Courts that they had to provide effective communication in the courtroom. And that law or that rule is still in place to this day to provide interpreters for me or any other deaf people who are a part of something coming in front of the federal judiciary as a party or a witness. That rule covers providing effective communication for them. So this is just to kind of give you an example of how these things have gone. And we still have a long way to go because just having a rule or law about effective communication doesn't necessarily mean it's always happening. But that was my introduction in practicing law as an attorney, was facing these obstacles. So I worked in that field for about 19 years. The first 10 years I worked at a private law firm, and we handled a lot of litigation that dealt with the ADA and the Rehabilitation Act. And I practiced also in special education law when I worked for that private law firm. And after about 10 years, I realized that a lot of people with disabilities didn't have the financial benefit to be able to access our services. So that is when I started working in the protection and advocacy realm, or the protection and advocacy system, or which we refer to as P&A. It's similar to like Disability Rights Ohio, if you're familiar with that organization. I worked for that Illinois version of Disability Rights Ohio. Their name is different. It was kind of an odd name, so this just make it simpler. That's where I worked for the next 9.5 years. And it was the same kind of work. We focused on ADA issues, but our services were provided for free to any of our consumers. So in all, I worked in that realm for 19 years in Chicago. And then there was an opening at the National Association of the Deaf. And at first, I didn't think I wanted to become CEO. You know, I liked suing people. I liked being involved in litigation. And, you know, being CEO is kind of a big job. And, you know, we're looking for money and fundraising and, you know, interacting with the board, dealing with complaints that we are getting from the community at large. And then there's a little bit of legal stuff thrown in. So I really had to consider if that was a change that I wanted to make. And I wanted to stay in my beloved hometown of Chicago and keep suing people there, to be honest. But I realized that things that were happening that we were dealing with in Chicago, judges who were very hostile to disability rights cases. In many of our cases, we actually ended up losing. And we were trying to find a way to get the judges to really get it, and they weren't. And that was a big barrier. And the ADA is one of the stronger laws we can use to break down those barriers. So I thought, well, you know, let me just apply and see what happens. So I went through that process and I was offered the position and I accepted. When I started working there, they had a history of working with about 2 or 3 lawyers. And they had handled some cases on a bigger national scale, but not many. So when I got in there, I told them, I want to see more lawsuits. And they told me since I was a CEO, I could make that decision. So we went ahead and started adding more people to our team. NAD has another well-known lawyer called Mark Sharmatz. Sorry, the interpreter was having a hard time pronouncing that last name. So he started an NAD in 1977, and he still works for the NAD now to this day. It's been 46 years that he's been a part of the NAD. And I told him that he couldn't retire. I mean, I guess he's technically retired twice, but we keep getting him back. So I told him that he couldn't actually officially retire until he completes 50 lawsuits and 50 years of lawsuits. So he's committed to that, and I'm going to hold him to that. But he has been, you know, it was basically him and maybe 1 or 2 other people for all that time. Once I got in there, we created a team of 9 attorneys for the NAD. We have 5 deaf attorneys and 4 non-deaf attorneys, but those attorneys do know sign language though. They are fluent in American Sign Language. So we have a total of 9 attorneys. 2 of them focus on policy issues and working with the legislature and different governments to change laws and rules. And then the rest of us, well, we're out there suing people. And I'm going to be covering some of the cases that we've brought to the court. Some of them, you know, are kind of fun. Some of them are where the law required a lot of lengthier discussion. So I know some people might have questions, and just to keep this communication going as smoothly as possible, I would like to ask for everybody to hold their questions until the end, and I'll have a designated time for question and answer. So I have been with the NAD for 12 years, and we've had several landmark cases happen in that time where we are trying to change the system. And it would be impossible for us to accept cases from every deaf person that wanted us to throughout the country. We only have 9 attorneys. So we focus on legislative policy and advocacy approaches that we feel like would make some big changes. So it's kind of like the good cop, bad cop approach, if you think about it. And again, we, in that focus of legislative policy and advocacy change is the way that we go about it throughout the court system. Next slide. So there are not a lot of attorneys that provide effective communication. So I think the main thing to focus on is within the federal law. On the state level, you have your own laws that govern effective communication in each state. And I'm not licensed in Ohio, so I sadly won't be able to address that. But Katie might be a good person to talk to for specifically within Ohio. But just to say, I'm going to be focusing on the federal level. So the first law that I'm going to talk about is the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And a lot of people also refer to this as Section 504. Because there are other sections of this law that are also important, like Section 501, that covers for employment with disabilities within the federal government system. And that includes having to provide effective communication for deaf individuals as well as other individuals with disabilities while in employment under the federal government. There's also Section 503, which requires any private company that contracts with the federal government to hire people with the disabilities without discrimination and to provide the accommodations needed, which includes effective communication. Section 504, though, is the big one. That's the one that says all of the federal government, which I guess except for the federal judiciary, all of the federal government in its entirety and any place that receives any federal funding has to provide full accessibility, which also includes effective communication. And also a recent development is Section 508, which is of importance. And that's the law that requires the federal government to ensure that all their websites and any of their apps or digital programming that's connected to federal government and employment and federal services must be accessible to all people, including people with disabilities. So 508 was a big win for effective communication. When you're thinking about the internet and websites and accessibility for apps so that people who need differing things to have effective communication, whether they're deaf or blind or have autism or other forms of disabilities, they also need to make that accessible for all people. And that's what Section 508 did. Okay, so I am going to be going into each law a little bit more in depth throughout the slide. But just to recap, the first one is the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. The second one is the big one, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. Now, before the ADA, we only had Section 504, which applied only to places who were receiving federal funding or the federal government itself. So before 1990, if a deaf person, for example, wanted to go to a college, they could go to Gallaudet University, which Gallaudet University is the only completely deaf university in the world, or they could go to two other programs. One was called the National Technical Institute of the Deaf, and that's in Rochester, New York. And it's really a college system under Rochester Institute of Technology, and they are also funded by the federal government. And then there was also the California State University of Northridge, or CSUN. So those were the three big places that deaf people knew that they could go for college education and have it be accessible. Now, if a deaf person wanted to go to another university or college, they couldn't do that until the Rehabilitation Act was passed in 1973. And again, then it was only colleges or universities that actually received federal funding. So it did not apply to any private entities. So any of these private colleges and universities did not have to provide interpreters or captioning until the ADA was passed. The ADA makes it possible for deaf people and all people with disabilities to be able to go anywhere and get effective communication. And there's only really two areas that are not covered by the ADA. The first one is religious institutions. such as churches and temples, mosques, synagogues. Those religious institutions are not required to provide effective communication. Now, they should, but not everybody maybe needs to hear the word of God if they're not providing that, but they might do it because of that, but the law does not require them to. Also, private clubs that are not open to all members of the public do not have to adhere to the ADA. So what exactly does that mean? Well, the biggest example is golf clubs that usually require a private membership to be a part of it. They're one of the few organizations that legally can say that they don't want women to be members, or they don't want Jewish people or Black people to be members of their club, and they can get away with it because they are a private membership club. Another example of that is like the Lions Club or the Elks. Or it could even be, like the Black Panthers. These are all clubs and organizations that are private membership kinds, or the Ku Klux Klan for that matter as well. They're all private membership organizations. So of course, should they be allowed or be adhering to this? In my opinion, they should, of course, but the law does not require them. Other than those exceptions, every other entity is covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act. The next law I'm going to talk about is the Affordable Care Act, or which is commonly known as Obamacare. This was a great law that really helped to expand healthcare for many people who previously were not covered. This law also has a specific provision within it that covers effective communication, which I'll be talking about. And the most recent law that has been enacted, which happened in 2010, was the first one in the 21st century that provided, it's a Communication and Video Accessibility Act. And that really covers effective communication related to things on the internet. So I'll be talking about that law as well. Next slide, please. So back to the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and specifically Section 504. As I already said, it was the first law in America, and I want to say in the world really, that provided rights to people with disabilities. And there's this section here on the slide that I'm going to read to you, where in this law it says, no otherwise qualified individual with a disability in the United States shall solely by reason of his or her disability be excluded from the participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under, and then this next part is extremely important, under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance, or under any program or activity conducted by any executive agency. So I don't know if you recognize that word executive within that section. I don't know if you remember maybe from your high school civics class that we have the 3 branches of the government in America. Right? And the executive branch is basically the president, their cabinet, and the Department of Defense, Department of Labor, and so forth. Those are all examples of the executive branch. So that means this law doesn't cover discrimination that could be happening within the judicial branch or the legislative branch of our government, which means Congress currently still does not have to comply with this law. They can still deny services through their programs to anybody who maybe wants to work for the legislature. Yeah, it's our wonderful, complicated country. So again, with this law, the Rehabilitation Act with Section 504, it's important to note that it applies to pretty much everywhere because a lot of places receive federal funding. And if they don't, there's other laws that actually cover them. Next slide, please. Now moving on to the ADA. As I said before, it covers pretty much everything, and how it does that is through the 4 titles of the ADA. And the Title I covers pretty much all places of employment. The minimum requirement is there have to be at least 15 employees at a location or at a company for it to apply. Some states, and I don't know if this is true for Ohio, some states have their own laws where they replicated the ADA, but with some revisions. So for example, where I'm from in Illinois, our state law says any employer with at least one employee can't discriminate based on disability. So there are some state laws, and a lot of states do this, where they might enact an add to these federal laws to provide more access, but state laws aren't allowed to be passed that would actually diminish any effect of the ADA. So the ADA is the bare minimum. So anywhere in America, if there are at least 15 full-time employees, there are some additional rules for if there's part-time employees, but we'll just, to keep it simple, if you have 15 full-time employees, then Title I requires you to comply with the ADA, which also includes complying with effective communication. If there are less than 15 employees, then they don't have to apply, or they don't have to comply with the ADA. And this is just for Title I is what we're talking about. Title I is the one that deals with employment, and that's the only one that has that requirement of having at least 15 employees. Now, Title II is for state and local governments, public entities. So the state of Ohio, the city of Toledo, the county of Lucas County, right, locally. All of those entities have to comply with Title II of the ADA. So that might include the Parks Department, elementary and high schools, colleges, state and local universities, courthouses, libraries, like the one we're in right now. All of those parts of those public entities then have to comply with the ADA under Title II. Now, Title III is where it gets a little confusing, because there is the word public in here, which often we relate to governmental entities. But really, this is for other places outside of the government that have to provide accommodations, reasonable accommodations. So there is a difference in this term, the terminology they use under the public accommodations part. In the employment in Title I, they say they have to provide the accommodations for that person to be able to do their job effectively. Now, when we're talking about Title III, the public accommodations are for private entities, where people of the general public might use their businesses. So basically, it's like stores, restaurants, museums. Now, if the museum is run privately. If there is a museum that is actually run by the local government, then it would fall under Title II. Similarly with schools and universities, if it is a private school or university, they're under Title III. If it's a like governmental school or university, then it has to be under Title II. And it's not very important to really memorize Title II and III and where everything goes. It's just to make sure that you know how the law appropriately covers all of these mandates for effective communication and other services as well. Last but not least, we have Title IV, which is telecommunications, like relay systems, to provide those kind of technological advances for them to be able to make phone calls. Now, before the ADA, many deaf people will tell you this, they couldn't even order pizza. We couldn't call 911. And I remember growing up, I used to always have to ask my mom to call a girl to ask her on a date for me because I couldn't use the phone. I'm still going to my therapist over that one, trust me. But nowadays, because of this law, we are able to use the phone systems and communicate just like everybody else. And so this is the basic promises of the ADA, or these titles. Next slide, please. Okay, this slide has a lot of words on it. I'm not going to try to read through the entire thing. My understanding is that the slides were posted on the website and given to anybody who requested them so they could review beforehand if they wanted to. So what I'm going to do is just give you an encapsulation of what this slide says. So this is about the auxiliary aids and services part of the ADA. And this is the appropriate terminology that needs to be used. And this is for getting to effective communication. And this is where you can realize if something is a reasonable accommodation or not. And again, that covers all the other titles except for Title I for employment. It also applies to any kind of accommodation. Again, except for in Title I with employment, because it's what they need to do their job. So auxiliary aids and services are how they explain accommodations in Titles II, III, and IV. So if you're receiving services from the federal government or a public entity. So the highlights in here, it's saying to bring a qualified interpreter, and that could be like we have today, interpreters who are in person, or it could be referring to video relay interpreters, which is remote interpreting. And interpreting could be in American Sign Language or acute speech, or oralist speech reading interpreting. This can also cover written communication and real-time captioning, like we also have happening here. It also relates to any written and frozen information. If a person needs to make a phone call, but they don't need captioning or sign language, but they need some other adaptable technology to use the phone, this covers that. If there needs to be an audio loop or some other audio assistive device, that is another form of effective communication that is listed in here. Any amplifications or assistive listening devices for the telephone or in other things. And again, captioning, that can be either open captioning or closed captioning. Open captioning is a type that you're seeing here where everybody sees the captioning. Closed captioning is like what you have on your TV, where you can choose to have that closed captioning on or off. So that's the difference between closed and open captioning. Open captioning, you don't have the option to turn the captioning off, is basically the difference. Technology for telecommunications, specifically with phones, like I said, amplified phones, video relay phones fall under here. Video relay phones is where you are connected with an interpreter visually, where they know sign language and they're able to say what you're signing to the person on the other end of the phone and sign what they're speaking back to you. And that's different than captioning phones. There are caption phones, which provide captioning like you're seeing here. And there's actually some now related to AI or automatic speech detection. They use that technology. And that's where it would be only communicated or interpreted by a computer. So if somebody is speaking to you and you can't hear them, but you can actually speak for yourself, you can do that kind of phone call through this as well. TTYs are still listed here. They are very much not used anymore, but they're still there as an option, even though technologically we have more advancements that people have used them less and less over the years. And it also applies to any other things that a person might need. So it's not limited to just the examples that are given here. Again, because technology is always advancing, there's always new things coming out. So it also applies to any other things that might be available. And I'm going to talk about some cases a little bit later that included these technological aspects. And we'll go back into what life was like back in 1990. Next slide, please. So what I was just referencing in that last slide was the first part, and that was mostly for deaf and hard of hearing individuals. This next one also applies to people with other disabilities, blind individuals and things like that. There's qualified readers are included in here, taped texts, audio recordings, brailled materials and displays, the screen reading software that is used for anything on the computer, magnification software as well, optical readers, Basically, it's where a device scans something that's written to make it audible. Large print materials. And it says accessible electronic information, which just means basically anything on the web should be accommodated for people who are blind to be able to access that in a different way. And again, this can apply to blind people or deafblind people. Sometimes you might need to provide a certain type of technology to a blind person for them to have access to materials. That's all under here. And again, it is not limited to just the technology that is around right now. It has the flexibility to cover future types of technology once they're invented. Next slide, please. And I really wanted to highlight some important language here from the ADA because it also is present in other laws. But in Title II, it has a statement that a public entity shall furnish appropriate auxiliary aids and services. So that really gets to the point that it's their responsibility to provide that. And then under Section 2, which is again the one about public entities like local and state governments, is that they have to give primary consideration to the person with the disability and asking them what kind of accommodations they need or what they need to just have effective communication. Again, that one only applies to Title II, which is the public entities. So that's the hard part, because both the Rehabilitation Act, the ADA, and other laws, the other thing they do is ultimately the decision gets to be made by the provider. So if a person with a disability says they need XYZ, if the entity says it's too expensive and they'd rather use ABC, ultimately they're allowed to go forward with what they want to. Now, again, it still has to be considered effective, but then we get into like, what does that really mean? Because sometimes what they choose to use isn't really effective, but they're not really great at changing their minds. So then it comes upon the person with the disability to have to fight them on it to get any changes. So that's one of the cons of all of these laws, is that we have these laws and we have these protections, but it doesn't mean it immediately resolves all the issues that people face. Sometimes we do still have to advocate repeatedly about what we need and fight them on that. Now, when the ADA was written, it seemed that they were trying to figure out a balance between the needs of people with disabilities, but also what businesses would necessarily have to provide. And they tried to balance that and come up with some middle ground. And now we're here 33 years after the ADA and 50 years after the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And I feel like we've learned and experienced enough to know that we need some more deference to be given to people with disabilities in these laws, because they know what they need. And that's really the bottom line. So the fight continues. Next slide, please. So under Title III of ADA, we have some very similar language, but in that one, there is no language that says primary consideration given to the person with disability. What it says in Title III is a public accommodation should consult with individuals with disabilities whenever possible to determine what type of auxiliary aid is needed to ensure effective communication. So you might think that sounds really similar to the language in Title II, but it doesn't. Because in Title II, it says the primary consideration should be given to the person with a disability, which means that if the person with a disability tells them something, they really, really have to consider going with what they say. In Title III, what it says is that they should ask them, but they don't really have to go along with what the person with a disability wants, and they can make the choice on their own. Again, it's supposed to be a choice that is still effective, but the entity is the one that gets to decide if it's effective or not. And then the person with a disability, if they feel differently, they have to fight and provide proof to show that it isn't effective. Next slide, please. Moving on to the Affordable Care Act. it has its own language specifically dealing with effective communication. And it's under section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act. And this one's really important because it gives us an extra tool in advocating with this language. So what it says here is that any covered program that provides healthcare must ensure that communications with individuals with disabilities are as effective as communications with people without disabilities. So that it's basically saying they have to have the same playing field. It also says that they shall provide appropriate auxiliary aids and services, including interpreters and information in alternate formats to individuals with impaired sensory, manual, or speaking skills, where necessary to afford such persons an equal opportunity to benefit from the services in question. So section 1557 has this additional language here, which is important because it has more enforcement. It kind of gives it more teeth. And it has more punitive language in it for those who refuse to provide effective communication. So this is a tool that we can use and should be using within the healthcare arena when situations occur there. Next slide, please. So continuing with section 1557, again, we have the ADA and the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. But some of that same information is spelled out in the Affordable Care Act about the auxiliary aids and services. It's pretty much almost exactly the same language as it is in the ADA and the Rehabilitation Act in defining those. Next slide, please. So the final law that I want to talk about was the Communication Video Accessibility Act. So during this time in 2010, the NED and other organizations, including organizations for the blind or of the blind, worked together to fight for these changes because during that time, like right before 2010, you know, we were able to have some access to television programs, for example. You know, and deaf people were pretty much able to watch almost everything and have access to it. Okay, and starting in 1996, captioning was mandated in televisions. So we had over a decade to get to 100% accommodation. So after 10 years, we're at 2006, and pretty much almost everything had captioning. But there wasn't a lot of audio description happening for blind people. It was a much smaller percentage. So they were still fighting to get that accommodation. Now, then with the deaf community, the problem they started facing was there were a lot of TV programs that were being shown on the internet. So in about 2007 to 2009, we started seeing, you know, everything on TV was captioned. And the same TV programs and movies that would be shown through websites on TV channels, like let's say CBS, for example, at cbs.com or nbc.com or abc.com. All the programming that they had online had no captioning. So they had it on the TVs, but not on the programming that was online. And that was because the FCC had the authority, or they didn't have the authority. They were able to sanction people who weren't following the law to provide captioning on television sets. They had no law to sanction people for not providing that access on programming online. So that's why we fought together to pass the CVAA to ensure clear communication access on the internet and to increase the hours required for audio descriptions as well for that programming. Now we're in 2023. This law is older. You know, there's been a lot of technological advancements since 2010. So we are looking at pushing for and passing amendments to this law currently to actually make sure it's providing effective communication for our needs in 2023, as opposed to just providing for what our needs were in 2010. So again, it's a continual fight to ensure that the world is accessible as the world and technology evolves and changes. So for example, virtual reality is more prevalent now. How many of you have tried using any of those virtual reality video games or virtual reality entertainment? Okay, I see a few hands out there. Well, there isn't a lot of audio description in those or captioning or anything that could be an accommodation for people with disabilities. So we have a barrier in accessing virtual reality. Another good example is self-driving cars. Now, many blind people were thrilled when self-driving cars started to become more of a reality. And, they, saw that as a device they could use to get themselves anywhere. But then you have to ask, are those self-driving cars actually accessible? Not just physically accessible, which is an issue, but how the person who's in the self-driving car communicates with the car. Because again, there's no actual driver. So if there's a blind person, is the dashboard and the way that you communicate with the car accessible for somebody who can't see? Or for a deaf person, maybe there isn't a dashboard and they just have Bluetooth verbal communication programs in there for the self-driving car, which isn't accessible for deaf people. So we have that communication redundancy, which is an issue, which means that you have to provide multiple forms of communicating so that it can work for not just one set of people, but for all individuals. And another example could be a deaf blind person wanting to utilize that car. Then, if they have both a visual and a hearing disability, if they have both things happening, then they would need an even different accommodation or setup to be able to utilize the car. So those are all the things that you have to consider with the new forms of technology. So the CVAA, though, does cover hearing aid compatibility with telephones and telecommunications, which also includes smartphones, also expanded relay services to new technologies. If there's newer ways to communicating, like another great example is Zoom, is something that we all use now, or WebEx. It would apply to that, or telehealth platforms that are used. Now, during COVID, most of those things were not accessible, and many people with disabilities were left behind. And actually, all those programs were supposed to be covered under the CVAA, but it took them a while to kind of get caught up, especially with the video conferencing platforms. But those are covered under the CVAA for captioning or interpreting or any other different technologies that are needed to ensure full access for all participants. If you're accessing the internet on your phone, oftentimes that is in itself is not accessible for people with disabilities. If you can't see the things that it wants you to click on, or if you can't hear the descriptions that it's giving you, then those are barriers to effective communication. And obviously, deaf-blind people have been left behind severely in communication when it comes to the advancements in phones and smartphones. Even though the FCC has been trying to keep up, it hasn't been going well. Now let's talk about emergency services. Who got that emergency services alert a couple days ago on their phone? Anybody here? Should have been all of you. It should have gone to everybody with a mobile device. But now we have to, it begs the question, was that alert even accessible? Could a blind person hear what was actually said in the alert? Because that was part of the test, not just the noise. I don't know the answer. I'm hoping that it also verbally gave what information was visually available on the screen when the alert came out. Oftentimes they have, those emergency tests that go out through the radio and the television. And a lot of times those aren't actually accessible for all people. And those are older. Those are emergency systems that were set up back in the 40s and 50s. And so they're trying to adapt and update those. And so they're doing them on the phones, and we need to make sure that they're also being able to be accessed equally by all. And the last one on here is about video programs shown on the internet or television and movies. Next slide, please. So even with all these laws, these federal laws that are in place, we still need to take action because they don't always easily just apply to the real world. So for example, in the beginning of the Rehabilitation Act, there were a lot of hospitals that didn't receive federal funding. You know, they didn't accept Medicaid or Medicare. But the ones that did were supposed to be required to provide equal access to people in their hospitals since 1973. So what many people don't know is that hospitals were pretty much one of the worst places to actually get effective communication. There are actually two professions that are extremely resistant to the ADA, especially for effective communication. First one is doctors in the medical field, and the second one, attorneys. Yeah, those are the two professions that make the most money, and they are the ones that are the least willing to provide accommodations. It's unbelievable, but a lot of the lawsuits that have happened over the years have been suits against hospital, healthcare systems, and medical providers for not providing interpreters. Now, recently, in recent years, they've been more willing to provide interpreters, but only remote interpreting. And that's because they've been having to comply with another more recent law, which was the Language Accessible Services Act, or LASA. And that law actually requires all hospitals to provide multiple language and translation services through the phone or remotely. Now, that law was passed to help provide better access for people who speak a different language other than English. And that is where the remote translation services really came in. And they decided to add ASL within those remote systems. And it just does not work most of the time. So what you can get through a remote translation audibly, if it's a spoken language interpreter, is different than what you're going to get through video remote access, which is what you need for a sign language interpreter. So just imagine that you are sick and you only use sign language. You go to the hospital and they bring you something that looks like this cell phone I have right here. And that's the screen you have to look at to see your interpreter. It's like you're talking to Jiminy Cricket on this little thing. You know, how that little Jiminy Cricket used to sit on his shoulder in the old movies. It's basically like that. It just isn't effective. And what's worse is you're already sick. So it's hard to focus. It's especially on a smaller, tinier screen. Even if they use like an iPad or a tablet, that's larger screen, there's often lag time because of the internet connection or pixelation or continuous disconnections because of that. And a lot of times the interpreter isn't able to see everything they kind of need to see in the room to be able to effectively interpret. So I know there's one case against a hospital where there were 3 different deaf individuals that had issues. And they were all, you know, very serious situations. The first one was a pregnant woman who was there to deliver her baby. And I'm a man, but I can't imagine having to give birth, having a little TV screen or a tablet like right in front of my face the whole time. When an interpreter who's trying to help you to communicate with everybody there, but it's all in this little tiny screen. And, you know, her birth lasted for 12 hours. The connection was horrible. So that was the first case. The second case was a woman that was so sick that she couldn't sit still. She was constantly vomiting and had to lay in different positions, lay on the floor. She was going through a really horrible time. And the remote interpreting was on this tablet screen that was upright and farther up. And they kept trying to tell her to just look at that screen, and she couldn't do it. And the third one, which was the worst of all, was this woman who had surgery on her artery on the side of her neck and had sutures there. So she had to sit in a very certain way and not move her neck at all. She had to keep completely still. And they kept asking her, though, to look at the screen with the interpreter on it. And they even tried to move the screen to be directly in front of her, but it had to be at the end of the bed, which was too far for her to be able to see. So they put it to the side of her face, but she wasn't allowed to turn her head. So the nurse had the bright idea to move her chin herself. And what that resulted in was the sutures reopening, blood gushing out everywhere. They had to bring her back to the operating room to do emergency surgery to save her life. And these are the kind of things that we're dealing with when we're talking about barriers to effective communication. So again, back to the Rehabilitation Act, even when it was first enacted, there were a lot of colleges and universities that didn't provide effective communication. There's still some to this day that don't, or if they do, they're doing it by cutting corners. They're like, oh, we'll just provide this automatic, AI captioning. And again, captioning can be a wonderful service, but if you see the screen up here that's providing the captioning, you can imagine if you were using that in a class that you're sitting in every day that uses specialized terminology. How are you supposed to learn that terminology if the artificial captioning system doesn't understand it, so it doesn't display it correctly? It just doesn't work at times. And also, I mentioned attorneys. There's a lot of attorneys that do not provide access to effective communication, which could mean interpreters. It could mean in the way that they provide materials to a blind person. They often, even when they're asked, won't provide accommodations. And these are people who know the law. They're attorneys. But even though they know the law, a lot of them are not instructed in ADA. It's not really taught in law schools. It might be taught, but only as an elective. It's not part of the mandatory curriculum for law schools. It should be, but it isn't. So you should know that. So a lot of attorneys think it doesn't apply to their work, even though it does. And often attorneys have told me that, and this is what I've been told by deaf and blind and people with disabilities, that they, even when they tell the attorney that they should be complying with the ADA, they tell them, no, I know the law better than you do. And honestly, in all those situations, the person with a disability actually knew more than the lawyer, and they were in the right. So we have this one case here of the DOJ versus Camacho, where an attorney refused to provide an interpreter, and the deaf person actually had to file through the Department of Justice to explain that this attorney that was supposed to represent them in a case against a hospital that refused to provide an interpreter, that attorney refused to provide an interpreter. So there's a little irony there with that. But this was a big case that really made it clear to a lot of attorneys that they are supposed to be providing that. So nowadays, a lot of attorneys find other creative ways to avoid providing effective communication. They might say that the case isn't a good fit for their firm to take on, or that they'll refer them to somebody else. And then it just becomes the referral game where it just gets bounced around and nobody will accept the case. And that's still an ongoing problem we see. The next case is Perkel versus Indiana. So this is where they had to actually sue the court for refusing to provide interpreters in a case. So this was a person who was not a party, but was there physically as a spectator to the case. The deaf person, it was the mother of a son who was on trial. And they said because she was a spectator and not a party, and that the party was not deaf, that they did not have to provide an interpreter. But again, based on the laws that we have in place, where it says programs and services, that covers all parts of a court proceeding, which includes people who are just there to watch it. even if they're not a party. So in this lawsuit, they did one, and they forced the courts to be able to tell them that they had to provide interpreters for all participants, even if they're not a party. The next case is the National Federation of the Blind against Target. I think this one was about 2001. And in this case, they said that the online version of Target to buy, whatever kind of things you want to buy at Target was not accessible. So they had alt text, which, has the words that are behind the pictures for blind people that have screen reading software to be able to access the visual pictures, right? But the prices weren't included in that. So there was still a lot of information that was missing. So National Federation of the Blind sued, and this was in California because Target's headquartered in California. And now a lot of us often think that the California courts are more liberal and that they might have a better interpretation of the ADA. In this situation, it backfired. This court in California decided that the ADA said, quote, places of public accommodation, end quote, meaning that their interpretation of the ADA was that it only applied to physical locations. So if something was an internet-based thing, it's not called a place. It's, I guess, just located up in the cloud somewhere. And so that's what the court decided, is that the ADA did not apply to this. Now, in this situation, the NFB did actually win the case because Target did have a physical place. And they said if the website was an extension of the physical location or the brick and mortar stores, then it did apply, which they said did happen in this situation. But if there are websites that were retail establishments that were only online, that court determined that the ADA would not apply to it, or their interpretation of the ADA. So it actually almost became even more harmful for us because it set precedent in the law for future situations of retail establishments that didn't have a physical place. The last case here is the Department of Justice against Wells Fargo. And there was over 100 complaints that had been filed with the Department of Justice or the DOJ. And other places do this as well. But the Wells Fargo is a bank, right? Wells Fargo at that time kept hanging up on deaf people who were calling them through video relay services. They were their customers who wanted to call and talk about refinancing, or just call to check their balance, or wanted to call to open or close a bank account. And Wells Fargo repeatedly, purposefully would hang up on, disconnect on those calls. That was their policy. So a lot of deaf people were fed up with this. They were filing complaints with the Department of Justice, and they settled with Wells Fargo for $16 million. They required them to pay the $16 million for the losses and damages of those people who filed the complaints. So that was supposed to end the issue of them not accepting video relay calls as a policy. Now, there's still a lot of restaurants and other places that might hang up automatically because when they hear what's, the beginning of a relay call, they think it's a scam or a telemarketer. And so that's more about providing more awareness and education out there about relay services, but this ended it as a policy. Next slide, please. Okay, so you might see there's a lot of NAD cases here, and I might be biased, but I think we did some good work, so I wanted to talk about them. This is the case I just talked about, the National Federation of the Blind against Target. When I started at NAD in 2011, similarly, we had a big issue with Netflix, because Netflix, if you recall, initially was a DVD rental service. I don't know if anybody remember getting DVDs in the mail. You'd order a couple movies and 2 or 3 would come every week. You'd watch them and mail them back, and that was how the company first ran. So at that point, almost all the DVDs had captioning because of laws that were already in place. So of course, a lot of people enjoyed the services and used Netflix. Now, when they switched to a primarily streaming platform, only about 10% of their content was captioned. Again, even though it was the same movies and programming that they provided through DVDs, just because it was on streaming, a lot of them didn't have captioning. So when I first started at NAD, that was a lot of the complaints we were hearing from people in the community, that they want us to do something against Netflix. So I had to consider what law would apply. And again, it's the ADA did say that it applied to any newer technologies. But then I remember this NFB case against Target, which said that it only applied to physical locations, and Netflix does not have a brick or mortar location. I mean, of course, they do have buildings for their headquarters and offices, but that's not like for the public. That's, you don't walk in there and get a DVD. So I had to figure out how to sue them. So we researched with a law firm, a nonprofit in California, DREDF. It's Disability Rights Education Defense Fund in California. And they're a wonderful nonprofit and disability rights organization. So we teamed up with them and we figured out how we could go after Netflix. We knew that we couldn't do it in California because of the lawsuit that had just happened against Target. And Netflix is headquartered in California. So what we did is we found a different case in Massachusetts where the ADA was actually used to enforce or to make sure that an insurance company was accessible to people with disabilities. Because at that time they had started denying services to people with disabilities just because they didn't want to have them as clients. And they argued that they didn't have to provide accommodations and things like that because they didn't have a physical location for people to come in and talk to them. All of their services were provided through the phone. So in that case, and this was before the NFB v. Target case, in this case in Massachusetts, the court said it didn't matter because they were still providing things to the public and therefore had to make it accessible. It didn't matter if it was only through the phone or not. So we used that argument to say, you know, in Massachusetts, because of the precedent set there, that things through the internet had to still be accessible. Again, we were not going to touch California. So we were saying in Massachusetts because they had this precedent. Well, Netflix argued that they didn't have to follow that because they were based in California. And so they didn't have to follow Massachusetts interpretation. But and this was in federal court, but the court agreed with us and our argument and required Netflix to make everything accessible, even though it wasn't connected to a physical location. And that really opened the door for a lot of other lawsuits against web-based services and companies. So it led to agreements with Hulu and Vudu and Amazon and other streaming platforms. Basically, we said, hey, do you want to be friends with us? Or do we need to go to court against you too? And they all happily agreed to comply 100% at that point. So all of them became 100% in compliance regarding captioning. And I can't imagine, you know, we won this case in 2012. And then, you know, many years later, we couldn't predict that COVID was going to happen and that all of us were going to be stuck at home and going to go crazy, right? And one of our saving graces was being able to watch Netflix or Hulu and all these streaming platforms. So I can't imagine what that would have been like if we hadn't fought to make those platforms accessible. So luckily we had done that in enough time prior to make them accessible. The next one is NAD against Harvard and MIT, that next case. So at that time, Harvard and MIT didn't have their online course content accessible. And it was called MOOC, which stood for Massive Online Open Course. It's a type of courses that that universities provide to just really bring that information out there for the general public to access and not just their students. But their MOOC content wasn't accessible to people who were deaf or deafblind or blind. So the NAD sued them in Massachusetts and we won that lawsuit. So then they were responsible for making sure all of their content online was accessible. The same thing was done by a lawsuit from the blind community. There was another lawsuit against Domino's Pizza for their website, and Domino's tried to argue that blind people could just call instead of using the website, and that they didn't need to make the website accessible. But, sometimes you call repeatedly and nobody answers if they're during the dinner rush, and it's easier to just order online, right? But the website was not accessible for blind people. And in that case, the blind organization won that lawsuit as well. Also, there's an NFB against Scribd, SCRIBD. And that is a platform that was providing materials to make it accessible. But the blind community said that they actually made it harder for their screen reading materials to actually adapt the materials from Scribd. They refused to adjust their materials. The NFB, National Federation of the Blind, sued them. So that includes like PDFs and materials that are in certain formats to be read online. This lawsuit actually made all of those have to be accessible for blind people online. There's another case that was brought by the Disability Rights Organization of New York. It wasn't through the NAD, but through the Disability Rights Organization of New York against Governor Cuomo when he refused to provide ASL interpreters during the COVID press briefings. So Cuomo lost that suit. Then there was another person who also refused, that was DeSantis, who also refused to provide ASL interpreters. Well, and so I felt like it was pretty balanced. One of them was a Democrat, one of them was a Republican. But the DeSantis, it's in Florida, so we've been fighting. They just recently lost that case because COVID was over, but it's an ongoing issue because these type of things are going to keep occurring, especially in Florida when they deal with sinkholes and hurricanes on a regular basis. They have these catastrophic situations that are important for the general public. And then the NAD also sued President Trump because he refused to provide ASL interpreters at all. We won that case right around the time of the change of administration. So President Biden had actually agreed to provide ASL interpretations at all of the daily briefings whenever they were actually being aired to the public through TV and other media. And they also have to show the ASL interpreter completely during the entire briefing on the television and online. And the CVAA actually also pushed, we used that to push to make sure that we could actually see the ASL interpreter appropriately. And last but not least, NAD, we had a lawsuit against podcasting systems or podcasting platforms because podcasts are not accessible to deaf people. I think there's one more slide. If you can go to the next slide. Great. Okay. I don't know if we're out of time. I think we might be out of time. Katie, is it okay if I'm able to manage some questions? Okay. Thank you all for your patience with me so far for the last hour and a half. I really appreciate that.
If anybody has questions, I'm happy to bring a microphone to you. Just please speak into the microphone for the captioner.
Okay, I have two questions to ask you. My first is, where does NAD stand with texting emergencies like police and whatnot for the public? Because I know here in Ohio, we have a specific counties, but it's not all 88 counties. They have that emergency text phone number. So nationwide, what's ADA's stance on that topic?
That is a really good question. So right now, the Department of Justice has a rule that says any 911 call they must have a TTY accessible line at all of the 911 centers, which of course is extremely outdated, and we've asked them to update that. And the second thing they require is relay services, but relay services also usually result in a delay in getting services. So the FCC has mandated that texting should also be required, that texting, you should be able to text to 911. Now, the FCC has mandated that, but they don't have the authority to tell the phone companies to do that. So right now, all the phone companies are willing to make that happen. The problem is that most of the call centers, the 911 call centers in America, don't have the technology to be able to receive a text message in their systems. So after that mandate, I believe that mandate from the FCC was around 2018, 2019. And in the time since then, we've seen an increase to about 40% of the 911 regional call centers that have been able to accept text messages, but not all of them. There was recently a suit against the state of Arizona because they were still at 0% of their counties being able to get text messages. That suit won. So we might have to continue to go after more states where we don't see that number rising. And we really need to push the DOJ to also have a mandate for the texting ability for 911. So it's an ongoing fight.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to hold on to the second question. I'll let someone else go.
Unfortunately, we only have about time for one more question if we want to be respectful of the agenda.
Okay, great. Could we be that person back there?
Yeah, can you raise your hand? Yes.
Hello. I got really excited thinking about how a couple of weeks or months of a battle could make a change that affects millions of people for a long time. You also mentioned that you receive many requests for trials and that you have to be selective about which ones are going to make the biggest difference and the most impact. And so I'm curious, how do you know which stories are going to lead to legislation that can really reach the most people facing discrimination?
I mean, there's really a lot of different factors that go into that. Is there good facts that actually exist in the case? You know, is it legally compelling? If the case is actually legally compelling, if we feel that it would improve people's understanding of how the law applies. For example, the suit I just talked about podcasting. Right now, there's nobody saying that podcasts have to be acceptable through transcript, for example. And so we've heard from consumers that actually want to have access to podcasting. So what we've done is gathered a lot of consumers that feel that way so that we could bring this case against a big podcasting platform company. And like I said, we have a team of 9 lawyers or attorneys with NAD. And so we debate the different cases that are brought to us internally and come up with like pros and cons, what possible results we think could happen. We also want to avoid some that might lead to a negative result. You know, basically ones that we think we might lose that could set precedent in a different way. So there's several different factors that we go through to determine if a case would actually change the system, you know, in ways that we can. And also, not gonna lie, we do shop for the best courts that we want to bring cases to as well.
Yeah, and thank you. And thank you for presenting. We
Thank
appreciate
you.
you being here. All right, so we promised a break at this point. So we're going to take about a 5-minute break. And our panelists, if you could come to the stage to get set up while folks are moving around, we will get started in about 5 minutes. I'm wondering if we have 3 mics. So we don't. Yeah, why don't you take one?
Get out of your way.
Chair would you like to sit in
I'm
now?
gonna sit, well, Shannon is gonna be between me and Sarah.
So you take these off.
I work best that way.
Follow the bullet points, or else we're going on a journey. Okay, I'm fantastic. We're gonna go 10 miles away from where we were supposed to start. All right, I thought you had me. So we met online.
Sarah, if you go on the end, I don't care.
Yeah. She's a service dog, yeah. All right. We'll switch chair right here.
Okay, so Sarah's number one. Oh, my mic's off. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, how are you? It's Becca, right?
Yes, it's Becca.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
I heard a student of mine was talking about this wonderful connection she had with you the other day.
Really?
And
Aww.
because she was talking about her experience and she's only been here for a
She's
year.
come really far.
Yes.
I'm so proud.
Well, she called you out specifically.
She
so-
did. I hope she didn't be like that.
The exact opposite.
Aww.
It was
Oh,
really
that's so
nice.
nice. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that kind of made my day.
Oh, I'm glad.
It's been kind of a dumpster fire of a day. So
Well, there, you can carry that with you.
Sarah, would you like this on your side? Or do you like all right? Really small.
I do.
Whatever.
It's from Lush. It's called Lord Misrule. Yes.
What is it called?
Lord of Misrule. Like I'm gonna cross. Yes.
So are we just passing the mic down?
I gotta go.
I gotta
Yes.
go.
I think so,
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of conversation, right?
Oh,
And then
but-
I have to like this. Oh, no, they
Funny stuff.
Yes. For the crowd.
Okay. Well, do we want for the panel part before we get to the crowd? Do we want to just have one for the three over there, one for the three over here? I think it's probably, so they're not just like, yeah, it's the entire time. Yeah. Whoever's on here. Yeah. Oh, no, not on all of them. I've got the list here. You're not first for all of them. Sarah. Do you want to go first and introduce yourself? Go for it. Yeah. I would say give the ultimate example of what I. So when we sit, I'm going to hand this mic that'll just be for you. Okay. So you'll hand it to me. All right, everybody, we're going to get started with our panel. So we're having a panel discussion on effective communication moderated by Dr. Rebecca Monteleone, who's an assistant professor with the Disability Studies program at University of Toledo.
Hello, everyone. So yeah, again, I am Dr. Becca Monteleone. I am an assistant professor at the University of Toledo in the Disability Studies program, and I'm very excited to be your moderator for today. As a visual description, I am a white woman with short dark hair and dark glasses. My dark hair has some really faded green tips on the end. And I'm wearing an Ability Center shirt, and over it I've got my favorite blazer, which is purple, white, and green floral print. So I am really excited for all of these different perspectives that we have today on effective communication. So I'm not going to do much by way of introduction, but instead I'm going to ask each of the panelists in a moment to introduce themselves, to provide a visual description, and then to also just kind of briefly give an introduction on how effective communication looks in either your personal or your professional lives. So we are going to start with Sarah Soper, who is an accessibility specialist at the University of Toledo.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Sarah Soper, and I am one of the accessibility accessibility specialists in the Office of Accessibility and Disability Resources at the University of Toledo. A visual description: I am a white woman. I am short and curvy, wearing a charcoal gray sweater dress, slight V-neck. I have shoulder length, dark blonde hair. We'll pretend it still has some pink in it, but I think it's gone. And blue eyes. And I have a large yellow lab, darker yellow lab guide dog at my feet. And I think that is all of my description. Communication for me, and this is probably a very cliche way to answer it, but for me, in personal and professional instances, open, respectful, and willing to learn, I think, is my most preferred communication style.
Thank you, Sarah. Our next panelist is Shannon Seeger, who is the Director of Deaf Services Center of Northwest Ohio.
Hello, my name is Shannon Seeger. General and one-on-one, oh wait, let me back up. Sorry, myself, as a description, I work at the Deaf Services Center. Right now, I'm a temporary director for the services here in Ohio. I've serviced 37 counties. And I tend to focus most of my work here in Northwest Ohio. I am relatively short. I have short blonde hair, black glasses with a black puffy shirt and gray pants. My preferred communication varies. It depends on who I'm meeting with. In groups, I prefer to sign and have interpreters. One-on-one, I tend to speak for myself. I'm able to get along pretty well one-on-one. Unless you have an accent, then I might struggle. Or if your tone of voice fluctuates a lot, I might struggle with that. I'm good with English. I do text. I read well. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it.
Thank you, Shannon. Our third panelist is Angie Goodnight, who is the Advocacy, Information, and Resource Associate at the Ability Center.
Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to be here as well. As she said, my name is Angie Goodnight. I have been with the Ability Center for about 17 years. I am a white, short, 4'11", female with middle length blonde hair, wearing an Ability Center t-shirt. I'm pretty sure it says change minds then act. Think differently than act. So yeah, my communication, I really like to help people educate. I feel bad when other people feel bad. I like to try to make people feel as comfortable as I can, and just let's work together and we can get this done. So.
Thank you, Angie. Our next panelist is Jessica Weinberg, who's a self-advocate.
My name is Jessica Weinberg. I am a very short, under 5 feet tall, white woman with very thick, light brown curly hair, wearing black pants and sweater and a very dark maroon shirt and black rimmed glasses. I was diagnosed with autism. Maybe we'll get into that later. Early, right when I was leaving high school and going into, post-secondary education. And I'm not speaking on behalf of any organization today, but my work and volunteer work with different organizations, that many of them that serve people with disabilities, will be relevant to what I'm going to talk about today. The term that, because my mother was also part of the Autism Society for a very long time, and the terminology that we kind of came up with as a family was to say about autism disorders that your brain is wired differently. So that is that's where the different styles of communicating and how you understand and process interpretation when you're on that spectrum. And you're trying to communicate information to people whose brains aren't wired that way, and they have to communicate it to you.
Great, thank you, Jessica. Our next panelist is Mallory Crooks, who is the Marketing Director at the Ability Center.
Yep, so I am Mallory Crooks. I'm the Director of Public Relations, very similar to marketing. It's all under one roof. At the Ability Center, I've been here for about 8 years now, and my visual description, I am a short-ish white female with dark brown hair. I have a white blazer on, a floral blue top, and black pants. And something I want people to know about communication is it's always a learning process. So in my role, I work with social media and websites and apps, and obviously that stuff is changing by the day, and the platforms are changing. So it's a constant job to keep up with all those things. So just know, if you're sitting in the audience, like, this is overwhelming, it's also overwhelming for me, and that's my job. So yeah.
Thank you, Mallory. And then our final panelist is Adrienne Bell, who is an IT specialist at First Solar.
Hi, I'm really looking forward to this conversation today. I am about 5'7". I have brown hair and shorter length. I have like an olive tannish skin color, blue eyes, and I'm wearing a dress. In terms of effective communication, like Mallory said, it's a learning thing. We're evolving over time. I think what I would ask is to be courageous listener, make sure that when you're in conversation, that you are there in current presence and you're actively listening, that you're bringing empathy to the table, that you are being conscious that while you may have similarities with the person you are speaking with, but also know that everybody has different life experiences. And those experiences is usually what drives the conversation. So it's important to educate yourself in different disability terminology, religion, ethics. So those terminologies will help you and enable you to have effective communication.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, everyone. I'm really excited for the kind of various perspectives that you're all bringing to today's conversation. And I appreciate the kind of practice of effective communication through everyone's visual descriptors as we went down the line. So the first question that I'm going to ask, so what are some of the greatest challenges that you encounter to effective communication? And I think I'll start with Jessica.
My notes here. This one, I think you're kind of witnessing in action. What I was diagnosed with at the age of 18 was Asperger's, which was what they called back then they were kind of recognizing a variation on autism. People like me tended to be highly verbal and successful in academic endeavors. I was, a college-bound student that, could meet the definite, and that could lead to overlooking or missing, it wasn't obviously recognizable. What I had wasn't obviously recognizable as a disability. And I think today they just talk about the autism spectrum without this specifying Asperger's. But one of the first things I was going to say that was relative up here is any question that you ask someone like me can stump them if we're not expecting it. We struggle with processing and interpreting information, with thinking on our feet, with interpreting cues. You'll hear the term hidden curriculum a lot, and they're often talking about social norms, but that can be anything that's not really communicated directly, whether it's kind of an unwritten step in a process. If you're or if you're doing something like with a machine, or you're giving instructions, or just anything that's kind of not formally taught. Some people with autism communicate in pictures or patterns, and then there's those of us that are kind of all words, and that's me. Translating pictures and patterns can be very challenging. Interpreting we don't really interpret an environment and get a big picture. We don't really look around at how people are behaving and get societal norms from that. But sometimes we also don't pick up skills that aren't taught more formally. We don't think on our feet well, like I just said. All information that we take in too much information, and it all seems important. So we're very detail oriented, and it's really hard to come up with it's hard to summarize. One of the most basic tasks of some of the jobs I've had is to take down notes from a meeting or a presentation, and it's really hard because everything seems equally important. It's hard to hit on main points. And we tend to see details that aren't obvious to everyone else or don't seem important. And we don't interpret, what's not being said in words, or at least I don't. But then on the flip side, if we can hear something as a message, because it is in words, or if I can, sometimes we don't know that it's not intended for us. We don't know which information we're supposed to be taking in and acting on.
Great, thank you, Jessica. I'll ask the same question to Shannon. What are some of the greatest challenges you encounter to effective communication?
That's a good question. For myself, both personally and professionally. Personally, I do have some hearing family members. So oftentimes when we have big family get-togethers, everyone's chatting, having a good time, it's easy for me to get lost in the conversation because so many people are speaking at the same time and speaking over each other. So that can affect me personally. And then, I mean, just in general out in the public. So professionally also, sometimes it's a challenge because sometimes the interpreters aren't available. Sometimes we have to wait for the interpreter to show up on the phone, you know, if I'm using the relay system. And one of the biggest things I struggle with is when I expect to have effective, accessible communication, because I'm an advocate for effective accessibility. So sometimes, you know, there are posts or things, people that provide their own interpreter services and everything, and I'm always have to work harder to provide education and even advocate just for myself. We're really big on advocacy, and the more that you know about your rights and how to explain your rights, I feel like that really helps. Personally, my family is very supportive. They do sign. I am able to, you know, speak one-on-one in general, but just, you know, when we have those big family get-togethers, it can be a problem. But yeah, there's something that many of you don't realize, that you have that advantage of being able to hear what's going on, and that deaf people are always, typically at least, the last person to know. They finally get that access quite a bit later.
Thank you, Shannon. And then Angie, that same question for you. So what are the greatest challenges that you encounter to effective communication?
So I don't know if all of you see me walk up here or not, but a lot of times people don't realize that I'm blind. On my computer, I use JAWS. I have an iPhone that I use pretty much for everything. I love technology. Not everybody really likes technology like I do. But, you know, doing my job at the Ability Center like I do, I talk with people pretty much every day and connect them to resources if it's not something we, the Ability Center, do. And it can be challenging sometimes. As far as we've came in the accessibility realm, there's still places, websites, apps, things, lots and lots of apps that are just, they're not there yet. So it's a challenge. Sometimes it will take me a little bit longer to find a resource or a phone number for somebody. And that's a challenge. So, you know, I just take all that kind of with a grain of salt and realize that, you know, it might take me a little bit longer. Sometimes if it's really detailed and I'm talking to a person, I'll just simply ask them, can I call you back? And when I call you back, I'm going to have a lot of really good information rather than making them wait on the phone. So, but it can be a challenge finding all of those resources and listening to my computer. So.
Thank you. What I appreciate about all three of your answers is that there is no one way that effective communication can happen, right? The scope of what that looks like depends on the person, depends on the situation, depends on the day. And so there isn't just one solution for what effective communication means. So the next question I'd like to ask, so what are some situations where effective communication is particularly important, and how can someone ensure they're effectively communicating in that scenario? And I think I'd like to start with Sarah on this one.
So I think some situations where communication can be very important and effective. Speaking for myself, and then I can speak professionally as well, but if I'm in an area that's very loud and it's disorienting, and I'm trying to navigate through the area with or without my dog, sometimes people can come up and just grab me and start dragging me where they think I want to go. Because I mean, you know, people are mind readers now, so they just know, like, look, this blind girl, she wants to go over there, but really I don't. I want to go over there. And so sometimes I will say to them, with a smile, like, don't push me like I'm a shopping cart. Like I'm not. You don't have to. You can let me take your elbow. Let me walk with you. I'm pretty chill and happy to educate. Some people are busy or just don't feel like it that day or whatever. But to me, communication is effective when you are being clear and concise, and when you are coming up and grabbing someone, or maybe you're providing only visual feedback that the person doesn't recognize, that can be a bit of a challenge as well. So the way that we kind of deal with that type of situation would be to stop and explain to the person, like, this is how I would like you to guide me, or this is how I need you to describe the layout of this intersection or whatever. And that's kind of how it works best for me.
Great, thank you, Sarah. One thing that strikes me about your answer and some of the other things we've heard already is how much effective communication relies on your communication partners listening and recognizing that people with disabilities or disabled people know best for themselves, right? And so that requires some trust and some education on the part of whoever you're communicating with. So I'll ask that same question to Jessica. Are there some particularly important situations where effective communication really matters?
A lot of my notes and things I thought about in preparation were about workplace kind of scenarios. I would have, and people with autism would have done a lot better would do a lot better in job interviews if they worked like like it worked for the panelists today, where we were provided with questions to think about in advance. Because one, it's hard to think on your feet, and also sometimes interpreting the question, like, tell me about yourself, isn't a very, which is often asked in interviews, isn't a very concrete instructions and requests are communicated best to somebody on the autism spectrum if they're very concrete. And even then, sometimes I think you run into problems, like when an interviewer says, tell me about a time when, and because another part that we can struggle with is making connections among different kinds of social or other situations. We may not see what every situation is kind of different to us. We don't really see generalities and cultural patterns. But another situation that I'd like to mention, because I heard it in a training recently when a police officer said that one warning sign of a situation might become unsafe is that somebody's slurring their speech and they're under the influence. And this was a population of people that work with people with disabilities that he was speaking to. Now, not every one of them, of the clients, slurs their speech, but it occurred to me that he didn't offer that as a caveat when that can be a disability, a way that a disability presents. And it's important, I think, to have enough awareness that because that somebody who has that kind of impediment or those kind of challenges isn't mistaken for being under the influence or some other form of problem that is then seen as more of a threat. So I thought it was interesting. In some situations, yes, it might be true about under the influence, but is somebody in his position, aware that it's not always.
Thank you, Jessica. And so I think one thing that came up quite a lot this morning were auxiliary aids and services. So I think I'd like to pivot to thinking about those a little bit. So I think I'll start with a question for Shannon, which is, can you describe the role of auxiliary aids and services in ensuring effective communication?
So for myself, a lot of what we depend on is the captioning, and then also access to written materials as well. Remote interpreting, It has a lot of additional things added to that. Oh, but for the captioning specifically, there's a UB Duo where you are able to both type at the same time. That's really nice. There's another, it's very beneficial. Many of those equipments will depend on the situation and the environment and the people involved. You know, things will vary on what I need and what I don't need. It's not like, I don't like when a person just assumes what I need. You know, they tend to just kind of assume, but I know what I need and I will ask for specific services because maybe this is more effective than another one. And it's interesting because I've noticed that many agencies, state, public, all agencies, any kind of entities, they'll struggle with understanding what is a reasonable accommodation, understanding exactly what that means. And what happened back when the ADA passed back in, 30 years ago, back in the 90s, there was a lot of education available and a lot of going around and teaching people about it. But now those people, where are they? Right? They're not here anymore. So we need to go again. We need to reteach everyone again. It's been an interesting process.
Thank you for that. I'll ask the same question to Sarah about how auxiliary aids and services ensure effective communication.
I think personally for myself, there are a lot of ways to use different auxiliary aids and stuff to support communication. I think one of them is accessibility of like photos and stuff. Like if you're on social media and you're looking and you're thinking people are communicating something through a picture, which I mean, I think a lot of us have Instagram on our phones and look at it all day and Snapchat and all the different things. Think of how much of your life is in pictures. And then picture looking at that same story, but not being able to see the picture and using some type of like AI software that says, photo may contain image of house, shoes, and dog. It's like, okay, that's not very helpful. What are you trying to communicate here? Or they'll do that challenge. I'm sure everyone's seen it. 10 days of no words, tell us in pictures, blah, 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 blah. So I think one way of effective communication for me are things like photo captions, photo descriptions. And it sounds like such a small thing, but so much of our world is pictures. So it's important that people kind of keep that in mind when they're doing the 10-day photo challenge or I'm going to show my story, that you might have blind people who are on your feed as well, who would like to be part of that conversation, but can't because they can't access the picture.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sarah. And I think, it reminds me the sort of like the right to leisure, the right to social media, the right to communicate with friends. These are rights that often I think get buried underneath these rights for education or work or, very important things, right? But the right to have a community is something that we need to be thinking about around effective communication as well. I'll ask this question also to Angie about auxiliary aids and services.
So I'm right there with Sarah. So much of us on social media and we both have iPhones and it's called VoiceOver, and it's coming further and further every time. Apple personally is right out of the box. It's fantastic. But you either love iPhones or you hate them. So I love mine. And I was searching through Facebook, part of my morning routine, and a picture came up that my cousin just posted. And one picture said a boat and a jet ski. So I don't know which one it was. I'm just assuming he got both. So I'm like, sweet, wow, good for him. He lives in Florida and that's cool. I use my phone constantly. I can even take a picture of something with my phone and it will read it back to me and tell me what it is. I can hold my phone in front of any printed document, even such as a menu, and it will read it to me. To me, that's real independence. Yes, you know, at restaurants and stuff, I have people that's going to read the menu to me, but I would much rather put in my ear pod and listen to what's on the menu and pick it myself. So, you know, my auxiliary aids and things that I use are essential, literally essential to my life. I don't know what I did before having an iPhone and the technology, and you know, even on websites, the pictures are named. Mallory does the whole Ability Center marketing people, they all do a really good job. If there is a photo, it'll say 2 women sitting at a picnic table, or you know, whatever it may be. So that's really super cool that things are described through, you know, different auxiliary things.
Thank you, Angie. And then I will ask this question also to Adrian.
So the benefit of going last on a question like this is most of my ideas have been stolen. But I will say that in terms of effective communication, what is important to remember is that everybody receives information differently. So what I would suggest is making sure that you are providing that information in multiple different channels. So for example, the same information is provided in written content. It's provided in audio. It's provided by images with alt text. It's provided in a multiple different channels. So that way, those that are receiving the information can process it in the way that they desire. So that's kind of what I would say in terms of ensuring that you have effective communication is really about providing that information in multiple different channels.
Thank you, Adrian. Another thing that came up quite a bit in this morning's presentation was about web-based communication. And so I think I'll start with Mallory here. Can you describe how your profession ensures web-based communication is effective?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is to make your vendors aware that this is something that's important to your organization, because I'm not a coder. I'm not in there in the back end and making everything accessible. When I'm having a meeting with people that run our website, I'm like, okay, I want you to know we work for an organization for people with disabilities, so we got to get this right. And we actually use a service called Accessibility. Some of you may be familiar with it, but it is free for nonprofits that are disability focused. And I'm happy to share information about that. But they actually have a option on the side where you can click on it and it can say, make my website accessible for people that are blind, make my website accessible for people that live with autism. And it actually changes the content. It's pretty wild to watch. But we use that platform as well. And I do have my cheat sheet here on a couple of things. Descriptions on buttons. Instead of saying click here, say click here to register. Because if you're just sending people in a million directions on buttons, be descriptive. If you have an image, sorry, I thought it died. If you have a image, to make sure that their descriptions, obviously, a cheat sheet that I always do is open up a Word document. I have a Word document up every single day, all day. And when I pull pictures, you can actually do a generic alt text, and it's not going to be perfect. Again, it might be like a dog in a park. So then I have to say, okay, that gets me started, but what is this dog in a park doing? Do they have a Frisbee in their hand? It's just something to kind of get you moving. And to not focus on tables, to make sure that text is the main piece of content that's on your website. Structure your website with a lot of copy and headlines and make them consistent. So I know if my JAWS is reading me a certain size, I know that's a headline, and I know the rest of the copy underneath it is just paragraph text. Avoid using placeholders in your forms. So this is something I learned just recently. If you are creating a form and you have a hyperlinked option that's auto-populated, that doesn't pick up. You have to make sure that it's something people can type into. So that's a few things. So.
Thank you. And I'm sure people appreciate that kind of practical advice of kind of A, B, C, do these kinds of things. Adrian, I wondered if there were other things that you could think of to add on.
So I think to take a step back, when we are in any organization, if you're working, you know that email is a common form of communication, writing, documentation, those kinds of things are common forms of communication. So before I even get to the web base, I really encourage organization to really start utilizing the Microsoft Accessibility Checker. It is not foolproof, but the more that you run that accessibility checker in your Microsoft Word document, your PowerPoint presentation, the more it will become a habit. It will help you understand the why we need to make this accessible, who is it helping. It also helps you understand how to fix the problem. So while it's a technology tool that may not be perfect, there's lots of flaws in it, it does help you understand and help you make sure that your content is accessible in habit so that you're constantly doing it. So once you get your day-to-day communication and you've got it to be a habit, then when we start to look at our websites, all of our intranet, SharePoint sites, everything else, that is when, like Mallory mentioned, we use Accessibility Insights, which is another accessibility tool that you can use and run against your website and get a good understanding of some of the issues that are present in your site. But I also would say that we also acknowledge that it doesn't cover all the different aspects. So a lot of times that's when usability testing or usability focus groups, having discussions with people in your community, asking them their input helps you make sure that not only from a technology standpoint are you meeting the standards, but that you're also making sure that your message is getting out to who you want it to get out to in the community.
Great. Yeah, I love that reminder to always make sure you're actually including your audience in the way that you understand.
Did you say the name of a specific Microsoft tool or?
It's the out of the box. So any of your Office products like Word, PowerPoint, it's on the your spell check. It's exactly like that. It's called the Accessibility Checker. You do have to have a more recent version of the Office products. I know it's 360 products or 2016. And now I know that the Accessibility Checker is offered in the Microsoft product.
Yeah, it's a great resource. So we are reaching the end of our time. So I just have one more question that I'm going to ask to all of you in turn, which is, what is one piece of advice that you would give someone to best support effective communication? And I know one piece of advice is probably difficult, but I'd love to hear what you all have to say. And I think I'll start with Mallory.
So I think the one thing I would share is just to utilize the technologies that we already have. So I kind of talked about the Word document and how that gets you started with the alt text. Something we do too is we have a podcast, and I know obviously those are not 100% accessible. So guess what? We upload our podcast on our YouTube that has transcription. So that's not a perfect solution, but we're still offering that content in a way that's deliverable to people. And then I always use my voice to text. So if I need to put something in plain language, or if I need to take an email, I wait till it's all done. And then I'm going to say, okay, this is what I have to transcribe in plain language, or this is an image that I have to give alt text for. Then I talk to my phone and I look at it at the end, and then I'll throw it in ChatGPT, or I'll print it out, and then I'll kind of look and kind of decipher what things need to be edited. So I really focus in on my other pieces of technology to make things accessible. I work with it all. So.
Thank you, Mallory. We'll go to Jessica next.
From the perspective of, if you are an organization and you either want, if you're conveying information to people with disabilities that are about your programs or your events or whatever you're doing, there's two important points. Keep it as concrete as possible. like if you were discussing something that's not a real concrete topic, look for concrete things the person can do, needs to do. If you're giving them instructions as part of a program, if you're the boss or an ADS program for services, give concrete instructions. And I think you also have to kind of be available and be on tap to answer questions. I don't know that you can always anticipate. I've learned this more and more, that people don't always anticipate every detail that I think about or that I need to ask, even in small tasks, or they think it's like something else I've done, but there's just enough change to make it look different, because to us, every situation, everything's kind of different from each other. So if you're like the person taking like registrations for an activity, be prepared for them to need to ask some questions, whether it's by phone or email. Sometimes that's about the technical process of the registration. Sometimes it's about the activity. Be able to give concrete instructions and be prepared to fill in more details in response to their questions.
Thank you, Jessica. So Sarah, we'll go to you next for your one piece of advice.
Okay, we're supposed to do one, but I have 1.5, but I'll make it really fast, I promise. So my first piece of advice, and this sounds so basic and like obvious, but I think sometimes we get so wrapped up in the technical, well, I'm going to be meeting with this person today, and they have, they have multiple diagnoses, and I'm just not sure. They have a physical disability, or they have whatever. Ask the person. I know that's like a shocker. Ask the person, what works for you? In this class where there's all this information and you need to process it, what is going to work best for you? How is that going to be helpful? I've only met, I'm not very familiar with what you're asking, what you need. Why don't you tell me a little bit about what is helpful for you? Sounds very basic, but that's kind of how I operate with my students. And that's how I recommend when people meet me, I'll say, just ask me. If you don't know what you don't know. I mean, I can't be mad at you if you don't understand that. Just ask. It's so basic. The other half, because I promised I wouldn't be very long, is if we talk about this discussion, this conversation of communication and effective communication, and we've talked about a lot of great things in technology and so many different things, it is so much better to be proactive than reactive. So if you start making a lot of this effective communication part of your thought, part of your part of your flow, you will find that it won't be the last minute and you're sending out like a survey or a form that you need people to complete, and then you're like, crap, it doesn't have text boxes, it doesn't read anything, or oh gosh, the colors are wrong, or you know what I'm saying? Like, if you just think from the beginning, how do we make this universally appropriate for everyone, using like universal design, making it work for everyone, you're going to find that you're not going to have people that are struggling with your forms of communication, be they written, verbal, whatever, because you're going to ask, and second, you're going to be proactive. And I think those are my two little very basic pieces of advice.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Shannon.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on that. That was such a perfect lead into my advice. So typically when I ask for effective access, let me back up. So for example, just in the healthcare system, that's really key because it's medical. Being a self-advocate is important. I will say, I need an interpreter in the room with me. I've had a nurse say, we only provide remote interpreters, that's it. And I said, nope, that's not how this works. I need effective access, which means I need an interpreter in the room. And they said, nope, that's not how it works. So I said, all right, who's above you? who's the nurse in charge? And they said, I am. I was like, okay, who's your supervisor above you? And they're like, well, that person's busy. And I was like, okay, I need effective access. Do you mind getting me the director? And then sometimes there will be a lot of back and forth and I'm like, no, I need this. That's the end of it. And so they bring in the director and I'm explaining, I need an interpreter. And this is advance notice. This is not like last minute, I just walked in. This was ahead of time. And then sometimes they'll be like, well, you're not the patient. And I'm like, you're right. I'm not the patient, but I'm the caretaker. I need to know everything. And then they'll be like, well, blah, 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 you know, you're not this person, you're not that, there's not this, there's not that. And I say, no, let me make it very, very clear for yourself. I am the caretaker. I need an interpreter. And then sometimes they'll say, well, I'll contact the patient. And I'll say, no, you won't. You'll be in contact with me. I'm the one that's requesting services. And they're like, okay, we'll put everything in writing. And they're like, what do you mean? And I'm like, I want you to put in writing what it is that you're going to do. Put this in writing. They're like, well, let me check with the legal team first. And I'm like, oh, please do. And guess what? I got the interpreter, you know, for the whole time. But anyway, you have to know how to advocate for yourself. You have to ask for evidence if they're going to tell you no. You know, if they try to tell you anything, ask for them to document that. Don't just accept no as that answer. Sometimes that might be the final answer, but still document that. Get that evidence so that you can make a difference in the system.
Thank you, Shannon. We will go to Angie next.
Sarah said hers was going to be really short, but mine's going to be shorter because she stole all my answers. So I guess we're just a lot alike. I don't know, two blind girls. My number one thing I would say to anybody is, and I get this from a lot of experience from people, when I tell them that I'm blind and then they're, oh my God, I'm sorry. Because, you know, I don't know. I've been told I don't look blind, but ask, just ask us. You know, I have, people have reached out to me with websites and just send it to me and say, hey, Ange, can you check this and let me know if, you know, it reads well, or, you know, I'll give good, you know, feedback. I'm not going to fib to you. I'm going to tell you just exactly. But, you know, if you don't know, that's okay. I tell every person pretty much that I talk to day to day that no question is a bad question. So if you don't know the answer, if something's accessible or not accessible, find somebody that may have that answer for you and ask that question, because it's still a learning process for all of us. And that's how we learn, is by asking questions.
Great, thank you. And we will close out with Adrienne.
So how do I support effective communication? I think at the end of the day, it's a two-way street. You have to be willing to be self-advocate for yourself, but the other person has to be willing to listen, to try and understand, to put themselves in the other person's shoes. I think that it's important to remember to, if someone asks you to repeat exactly what you said. If that doesn't work, then the second time, try to rephrase the question, try to rephrase what you're trying to communicate. But I think at the end of the day, it's really about being patient. It's about understanding and learning how that person receives the information. And then at the end of the day, you both will be successful.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our panelists for a really informative and thoughtful panel today. So yes, let's give them a round of applause, please. And then also thank you to Sally and Katie at the Ability Center, who really demonstrated some effective communication to enable this panel to be so successful. So shout out to them as well. And I believe we are out of time. And so we are ready to move on to the next thing. But thank you all so much. Have a great afternoon.
So don't leave.
Want to get up close?
So we can take another little break if you guys need to get up and move around for just a couple minutes while we get the next presentation set up. Yeah.
I know it. We can go. I'm sorry. It's okay. You ready? Yeah. Okay, here. Can you take this? I think Angie wants to say goodbye to you.
Hi, were you able to get a hold of Monica?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep. So I'll say a couple things and then. Is that good?
Am I talking to everybody?
Yes.
Okay, because we got I got my homework.
Yeah, I have one. So we're not,
Yeah, go ahead.
will the camera still get it?
There are two cameras, so they'll just focus on you.
I'll move forward with the other.
Okay. All right, we're ready to get started again. I want to, before we get started, I just want to thank our wonderful panel. They were incredible. And also thank Howard Rosenblum, who had to leave us to catch a flight back to DC, but he was also, what an incredible presentation. Our final presentation is in honor of our Community Partnership Award winner, the Toledo City Council. We present an award every year at the conclusion of this seminar to talk about a partner that has worked with us to really create access in a practical way. So this year it goes to City of Toledo. We have the sponsors of the bill here, Teresa Gaddis and Nick Comives, to present on the project. And our Executive Director, Stuart James, will say a few things. We'll hand over the award and then we'll give them the stage. So go ahead.
How's everybody doing? Good. I'm just getting worried there for a second. So I got my cheat sheet here. So the Ability Center of Greater Toledo, we give out the Community Partnership Award, and it goes to an organization that has worked with us to help our community become more disability friendly. And I'm really excited to be able to present this award, partly because I obviously have a hearing impairment, and so this affected me. But we were very fortunate to work with these two wonderful people on helping get a closed captioning ordinance passed in Toledo. It essentially requires all businesses with TVs to turn on the closed captioning. Pretty common sense, right, to make it better. But it's really wonderful that this year with the organization we get to give the award to, I'm really happy about this, to the City of Toledo and to two wonderful people. And so I have my award giver here. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It's an absolute honor to have this from the Ability Center, Mr. James. It's when Shannon presented the problem to us, it was like, that's something we can change. And it seemed, it was one law, but I think it's opened up the communications for so many people. And we made a goal on City Council to make Toledo the most accessible city. And this is just the first step in many.
I don't have much to add before we give away too much of what we're going to talk about, but it's just an honor to be able to work alongside so many incredible champions in Toledo. You know, I get to see Katie on several calls a month and work very closely with Councilmember Gaddis on a number of issues related to housing or public access. And so we're always proud when we can do something that really benefits any of our residents, but this in particular impacts all of our residents as well. And so we're just really proud to be able to work alongside so many incredible people in our community. So thank you so much for recognizing the City of Toledo. I also want to say that there are a number of city employees that are here that I see throughout. If you want to maybe raise your hands and wave. And many of these folks have been involved in making this a successful ordinance as well. So thank you for all of your work too.
I just want to add real quick, you know, we are very fortunate here to work with a city that is so cooperative. And it's not just this one, it's all the counties that we operate in. This is a great area of the country to do this. But I do want to take just 2 seconds to thank the advocacy team at the Ability Center. Katie is obviously leading that group, but we have Angie and we have Sally back there. And we have our intern whose name I just lost. There we go. You guys do a wonderful job. And, you know, we've had some tremendous successes in the 2 years that I've been here. And it's all because of the work that you guys do and that Katie does. And it's with help from people like you. So and people like all of you. So thank you very much.
And at this point, we're going to invite Nick Comives and Teresa Gaddis to talk about the closed captioning ordinance, you know, what went into creating the project and how they got it accomplished. So thanks to the two of you. I look forward to hearing you present. And if Shannon Seeger could also come up to the stage.
Hello. So my name is Teresa Gaddis and I sit on Toledo City Council and I represent District 3, which is mostly East Toledo and the South End. And we're here today to talk about the closed captioning ordinance. And they say that there are two kinds of people on Super Bowl night. The people that watch the game, and then the people that watch the commercials in the halftime program. So as I waited for the next round of commercials, I picked up my phone and I got on Facebook. And my notifications shared that I was tagged in Shannon Seeger's post. And when I clicked on it, I was really shocked. It was then that I knew that the city council could do something, and I'm going to have Shannon explain what she shared with us.
All right, thank you. So basically what happened that night, I had a friend of mine, I do know many deaf people around Northwest Ohio. And there was an individual that went with a friend who was also hearing, so a deaf and a hearing went together to a small country bar so that they could eat and drink and watch the Super Bowl. So the deaf individual said, hey, do you mind on this TV, do we mind if we turn on the captions? That's all. Just turn on the captions for the one TV. And the server refused. They said, nope, sorry, we're not doing that. And I was like, wait, I've bought drinks, I've bought food. I just want, this one TV, just, give me the remote and I'll do it. And they said, no. Don't waste my time, just no. So they got up, they dropped everything and they left. And that restaurant was in violation. They do serve the public. That was a reasonable accommodation that they should have followed. But because they took that story and we were able to talk about it and discuss, there's now a law that captions have to be available. They have to make sure that the city of Toledo is in compliance. So it's really nice. But that's what happened with that.
So, hello everyone. First, my name is Nick Comives. I'm a Toledo City Council member at large. So I serve the whole city. Shortly after the Super Bowl, probably on a late night call, because Teresa and I are both night owls, we were discussing this story that had happened in Toledo and how disappointed we were that the restaurant, the bar didn't participate in making sure that the reasonable accommodation had been met. And so Teresa said, we have to do something about this, which is a conversation we have frequently. And not every time does it come to fruition, but we were really fortunate in this case to see this partnership that we ended up developing through the three organizations that you see behind us, the City of Toledo, the Ability Center, and the Deaf Services Center, to come together and discuss what a law like this could look like. because we know that one of the most difficult things, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in depth shortly, is enforcement and making sure that businesses or places of public accommodation are in compliance with the ordinance. But first we needed to figure out what this would look like. So of course we went through the process of looking at ordinances, laws across the country to find some benchmarks. And so we're really fortunate to be able to work with some, like I mentioned earlier, incredible folks who are a lot smarter than I am, at least. I don't want to speak for Teresa, but who can figure out what the laws look like and mirror it. So we really looked at the city of Ann Arbor's ordinance to make this happen.
So this slide is talking about who's going to benefit from the captions. And obviously, yes, deaf people do benefit from having the captions, obviously, but there are also a lot of other people who don't speak English. Maybe they're in the process of learning English. Maybe in the environment, especially like in a library, if you have a TV on, but you're supposed to be quiet, right? One of those quiet environments, you can just turn on the captions so people can still follow what's happening. And the opposite is true. It's a very noisy environment. You know, people would be able to benefit from those captions, even if they can't hear what's going on. Individuals with cognitive disabilities could benefit from being able to see the captions. Individuals with autism, children that are still learning language, it helps them pick it up. You know, my children really benefit from having the captions turned on. They're above average readers by the time they got into kindergarten. Because, you know, your kids could benefit the same way my kids did. And the same thing, captions. There's been a lot of research on the internet. If the video has captions on it, it becomes more accessible. Also, senior citizens can definitely benefit, you know, if you have some hearing loss. And of course, just the general public. There's one thing I want to emphasize. Toledo could have up to 20% individuals in the city that have some type of hearing loss. So even if it's just in one ear. Deaf Services Center did some studies and they said, oh, there are so many people that struggle with hearing. Maybe they work in factories, maybe they're elderly, different reasons, but it would benefit everyone, not just deaf people. So this allowed us to know what's happening at the same time as you do, so instead of being that last to know.
So with that knowledge that we gained and as we continue to learn about how this would really help our city continue to grow and be a place for everyone, we crafted the ordinance that you see behind us. There's another slide that we'll get to next that will show the whole thing, but it's quite short in its design and quite clear. Just simply that if you are a place of public accommodation, that you must offer closed captioning and have that on your TVs. We are pretty clear about what it is, as you can tell, and who's responsible for it, whether it's the property owner or the business owner, all of those types of things that we have to consider. But at the end of the day, it just is quite clear that if you have a TV on in your place of business, then you should have the closed captioning on to make sure that it's on for everybody. And it ends quite simply that you have to have it on, and then that there are penalties. Everybody loves penalties. And so for us, it amounts to a $150 fine for each violation when a person doesn't turn on the closed captioning. And we find that out generally from reporting. So this gets into the question of enforcement. How do we enforce a law like this? Because we can't be in every establishment checking all of these TVs. So it's incumbent upon our residents, the people who are visiting our city, who are spending money in Toledo to find out these places where they're not using closed captioning. And of course, we don't want to just create a law like this and let it loose and not share with the folks who could be impacted by those penalties. So our wonderful Marcoms team through the city has helped to create some informative graphics and frequently asked questions that are on our website and some other things. So we consider this a soft enforcement mechanism that is just informative and lets places know that, hey, this is a law now, you must provide closed captioning in your establishment. You know, please turn them on for all people. And that's the first step, that we let businesses know that it was coming. And then this is what they will receive when they don't accommodate or provide the closed captioning. It's a little more in depth and lets them know that they are in violation and gives them an opportunity to correct their violation, and gives them a warning that they could potentially be fined. So this has been sent out through our diversity, inclusion, and equity department to various businesses throughout the community who have been found in violation. So we've made it pretty clear, pretty self-explanatory for our businesses. We have received a couple of questions. People ask, well, what if my TV doesn't offer it? Well, I'll tell you that every TV since I think 1993 automatically comes with closed captioning as an option. I doubt you're going to be visiting a place anytime soon that doesn't have a TV that has closed captioning in it. But at the end of the day, we really just need people to help us to make this happen. If you're in a place and you notice that they don't have them, you could certainly gently nudge, talk to one of the servers, talk to a bartender, talk to somebody in the business and let them know that they should have their closed captioning on. That'll be the first step. Obviously, if you don't feel safe doing that, please don't do that. But we have found that most businesses comply once they recognize that it should be on. And I've heard from several folks that when they slide a note across the table, if they need to, people respond appropriately. We have had some businesses, unfortunately, in Toledo who have, we'll say, struggled to comply with the ordinance. And those folks have received phone calls, sometimes from our mayor, to encourage them a little more forcefully. But we only know that because we get feedback from the public. So we really need you to help us to make sure that this is spread equally across the city. So you can call Engage Toledo if you are in a place that doesn't have the closed captioning on, and inform us that way. That will make its way to the enforcement folks who can then go out and enforce the law. But we just need your help to make it happen. It's a wonderful thing for us to have. We're very proud of the fact that Toledo is the city in Ohio to offer this protection or this law to accommodate folks in our community. We hope that it spreads. So if you're not from Toledo, please feel free to ask any of us here for help in contacting maybe your local lawmakers or how we went through the process. We would be more than happy to help you connect with your local elected officials to make that possible in your community. And I'm going to stop talking so much now. But we're definitely open to any questions that you might have.
Hi, my name is Lisa Kazawa. I am 5'7", 4'2" without these heels, just kidding. Maroon dress with a black sweater. I can't thank you enough, Katie, for doing this, because I have a cognitive challenged uncle, and I can't tell you how much I've learned today from being here. And I thought I was really on top of things, but clearly I'm not. I am new to a transportation company. I work HR, and I'm, wow, struggling with how we can better suit the Ability Center. We have PT vans, vehicles to help folks in wheelchairs, but we, as far as the hearing, impaired, that's something I think we need to work on. And I am open to ideas to what we can do to better serve the community for both blind, vision impaired, and so on. So please, by all means, if you have any ideas, I'm open. Okay, thank you. And thank you for your time. This has been wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that they're like the Deaf Service Center or the Ability Center. If you reach out to them, they probably have people that will sit and talk through that.
Yes, anytime. There is a question over here. There's a deaf person over here with a hand up.
In just a minute, you can also, our contact information is on our website. You can feel free to reach out at any time.
Hello. So, hi, everybody. I'm in the area that I work in or that I live in is not great for the closed captioning, and they do need some improvements with closed captioning. Like, for example, the TV stations, the captioning they have, it's not accessible. It's always overlapping line by line. And when I found out today that the FCC might have services to help with that, I mean, that was some great information that I'm going to give to the Dayton area, which is where I live, because we have an ongoing discussion about how to improve the captioning, especially a law like this to have captioning available in TVs out in places of business. That I think would be nice. So I think that's something that I would love to see happen in Dayton too.
I'm happy to help you. I'll go ahead and send you City of Toledo law, a copy of that, and also the one we got from Ann Arbor in Michigan. It would be great. You'd be able to meet with your city council people. And lucky for me, Teresa contacted me. I really appreciate that. It was really great. She was like, hey, what's going on with that? And I was able to explain. So knowing your council persons really helps.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. I'll get in touch with you. And there's, the local organization that we've been having that discussion with. So we'll get in touch with you too.
All right. Thank you.
Any other questions? Oh.
Hi, I'm Corey Tillis. I work at the City of Maumee. I was just wondering if you have a copy of that I could share with our council members.
Absolutely. And I happen to know a couple of your council members personally, and we'll be happy to connect with them to help them along if they need it. So we should connect.
So exciting to see people getting excited about the captioning. The next thing would be nice if the governor or the state had full open caption. That would be a wonderful goal, right, Katie? She's my other contact that I tend to kind of bug about these things. So thank you for putting up with me.
Any other questions? No. Well, the process on how something becomes a law really starts because somebody has an incredible idea, and ideally your lawmakers are paying attention and are open to considering what these ordinances and laws might look like. I'm really grateful to work with someone like Teresa who takes initiative and sees a post like that and responds, and always happy to help. But I just want to, before we go, say thank you so much for your time here, because I know that undoubtedly you're going to take these ideas back with you. And I wish you luck in all that you do, because every effort that you make is going to create a positive change where you are, even if it just starts the conversation. So I look forward to hearing about how your conversations are going, and I'm always happy to help along the way if you ever need some advice or just somebody to bounce something off of. But thanks for this opportunity to be here with you today.
All right, and thank you again. That concludes the seminar for this year. I would invite anyone in the room to join the Ability Center's Access Network. We do send out regular newsletters on different topics regarding accessibility. And we hold events like this usually about twice a year that focus on a different topic on the ADA. We always try to give the legal perspective, perspective from experience, and then also a more practical advocacy and action type perspective to give people ideas on how they can move forward on making our community more accessible. For those who are here for continuing legal education credits, we were approved for credits, and I have the activity code if you would just give me a second to pull it up. So, and if anybody is unable to catch this and wants to email me afterwards, I'm happy to send it to you as well. And then generally we submit people's bar numbers to the Supreme Court as part of the seminar. So the activity code is 524677. If anybody was taking this seminar for other continuing education credits, those are still pending, but we will be in touch with you once we get an answer back from the state of Ohio. Otherwise, this is the conclusion of our seminar. Thank you to everybody for coming. We hope that we see you again soon in the future. Another photo. Should I sit? No. I'm also happy to sit.